has been more than 200 days since Israel launched its military operation in Gaza. Israel's offensive came after an attack by Hamas militants left more than 1,100 Israelis dead and more than 100 kidnapped and held hostage. A delegation from Egypt is currently in Tel Aviv for ceasefire talks. Israeli forces continue to pound the overcrowded city of Rafah as they prepare for a proposed ground invasion. More than 34,000 Palestinians have been killed in the war so far. Meanwhile, pro-Palestinian student protests is spreading across the US universities. Hundreds of students have been arrested by the police after clashes across several colleges. The protests that began at Columbia, Yale, Brown and New York universities have not spread to places like Austin, Los Angeles and many more. A top Republican lawmaker and US House Speaker Mike Johnson visited the campus of Columbia University and demanded the resignation of the dean, but he was heckled by protesters and was forced to cut short his visit. We're now joined by two very special guests, Ambassador KP Fabian, former Indian ambassador to Qatar. He's somebody who is an expert on the Middle East, and Julia Senzon, managing editor at the Cornell Daily Sun. Thank you very much for joining us. Julia, if I can begin with you, give us a sense of how the protests are spreading across US universities with the recent clampdown that we've seen in some parts of the US. Is there going to be any let-up in the protests, or they are only increasing?
I would say that protests are still increasing. Cornell just joined the protest movement yesterday, which was one of the last schools within the Ivy League to join. I believe Princeton might have also started encampments yesterday as well. But I think that with the mass arrests at Columbia and NYU, movements have only increased since then and spread to more schools. So I think we are continuing to see an escalation in protests nationwide.
Julia, give us a sense of how this has really brought together, unified the student community, also the teacher community in the United States, or are there divisions, according to you?
Yeah, I would say that it has both brought together campus groups and also caused a diversion. The main organizer of the encampment at Cornell, and I can't speak for other schools, but the one at Cornell is a coalition of over 40 groups, which include both campus groups and off-campus groups, and including many affinity groups of different ethnicities. So I think it's brought together different campus groups, but at the same time, there are other campus groups that are in disagreement with the protest behavior, namely some of the Jewish groups at Cornell. That would be Cornellians for Israel and also Cornell Hillel for the most part.
Right. Julia, just stay with us. Let's also go across to our other guest. Ambassador Fabian, how do you see these protests that are happening across the United States impacting the US government stand vis-a-vis Israel right now?
Thank you. Glad to be with the Global Eye. Now, what we have to understand is that President Biden is also a candidate. So his decision will be impacted by his assessment as to how his electability increases or decreases by what he does. That is point number one. Point number two is that these protests are serious, but one can't say at this stage that they will develop into the large-scale protests we saw during the Vietnam War, which did impact on US policy. Third thing is that these protests are, of course, they call it pro-Palestinian, but we have to keep in mind that in some cases, Jewish students are also protesting along with, others. In other words, you cannot say that this is a protest against Jews or against Israel. It is against Israel's policies. And if I may use plain English, Israel is carrying a genocidal war in Palestine, and that has to be stopped, and that is what the students are demanding. They want actually the university to divest from companies which are benefiting from the war, that is the military-industrial complex against which President Eisenhower warned his compatriots way back 1961 in his valedictory address. So that is what we have to understand. Let us see how it goes on, because Biden is in a bind, and I had written earlier some time back that while Prime Minister Netanyahu is carrying out sort of a holocaust, President Biden is sleepwalking into electoral disaster. But let's see whether it will happen or not.
Right. Ambassador Fabian, I'd also like to ask you about expanding the operation, the Israeli operation into Rafah. Recently, Israel has been accused of war crime, mass graves. How do you think this is going to impact the Israeli government's policy? Will the Western powers change their stand vis-a-vis Israel as a result of what has been reported in the international media by international aid and humanitarian organizations about Israel?
Well, till now, the Western powers have been, what shall I say, have been asking Israel, have been counseling Israel to do A, B, and C. That is more humanitarian aid, take care of civilian killings, and all that. But the United States, that is President Biden, has not till now told Prime Minister Netanyahu, listen, I have been telling you this for so long, and if you do not if you go on crossing the red lines, then I shall condition the supply of weapons to your behavior. Now, that point we have not yet reached. And therefore, Prime Minister Netanyahu seems to have convinced himself that he can get away with blue murder, and President Biden's public pronouncements and his private pleadings can be ignored with impunity.
Right. Julia, if I can come back to you, as a student in the United States, what hurts you the most about the US government's policy and their attitude towards protesters across different states in the US?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to just speak for myself, but I think of the people that I've talked to, what has been frustrating is within campuses, campuses are trying to get basically the administration of each campus to divest from weapons suppliers that are going towards Israel in its current war in the Middle East. And I think that's what has been brought up campus by campus.
Are you also urging the US government to stop this military support to Israel, call on Israel to stop this offensive, because there have been a large number of civilians in Palestine who have died, a large number of civilians in Gaza who've been caught in the crossfire as well, and there's really no end in sight for the war that we continue to see?
Yeah, I mean, as an objective reporter, I typically don't express my public views about the Middle East or the administration, Cornell's administration, in this sense. But I will say that at Cornell, there was a referendum where students were asked two questions: whether the university should call for a permanent ceasefire in Gaza, and also whether Cornell should divest from weapons suppliers that are going towards Israel at this current moment. And the students voted by a 2-by-1 ratio in favor of both referendum questions, which means that supporting Cornell taking a public stance on asking for a ceasefire in Gaza, propelling a ceasefire in Gaza, and also for divesting from weapons manufacturers.
Right. Thank you very much, Julia, for joining us. And I'd like to thank Ambassador Fabian for those very sharp views as well. Always a pleasure to have you on our program. With that, we come to the end of Global Eye, but we continue tracking these big stories, what's happening in China and what's happening in the Middle East. This remains a focus on CNBC TV.